All right, all right, all right. We are back with another episode of Inside the Big Ring, and this is your host, as always, Stephen Brandis, coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin. And we have a very, very dedicated guest to getting this interview out. Dr. Alex Harrison, how are we doing, sir?
Doing well. Appreciate you having me on.
So where are we talking from? So where are you living?
I am in the RV as usual, but I'm in Arlington, Washington right now.
Nice. So for people listening, where can people find you? Just so if people want to be scrolling through, checking out stuff you have available, social media, YouTube, where can people find you?
Let's see. We have a YouTube channel Saturday morning. We have, and that was formerly Alacrity Endurance. But so if you see me introducing myself as Alex, Dr. Alex with Alacrity Endurance, that's why. So YouTube Saturday morning. We have a website, also Saturday morning, saturdayMorning.fit. And I have a personal Instagram account, and you can find me on Trainer Road and Slowtwitch forums if you're a nerd.
So I'm very curious about this. So I've been a long time Slowtwitch user, and I mean, how did that relationship kind of come about? Because I mean, it's a huge website. There's a lot of articles being published on there, and now you're writing articles on Slowtwitch. I mean, you've written a ton of articles for Triathlete Mag. So like, how did that relationship form?
It was very, very serendipitous. I was of blossoming forum user. I was mostly there learning like bike mechanic stuff, asking all the hard questions about why I stripped my bolt or whatever, like on my bike, or damaged the brakes or something, like all the newbie mistakes that everybody makes when they're trying to work on their bike the first time. And I started answering questions about nutrition because I was like, well, these people have really good questions, and these are things I know a lot about. And of course, people on Slowtwitch tend to be really interested. I would say, and it's a good place for debate. There's a lot of contrarian folks. So I just started answering questions there, and I think that the editor-in-chief, Ryan Heisler, probably saw some of my writing and thought that was valuable. And eventually, Michelle and I were looking for a place to park at altitude so that we could prep for the Tour of Redlands, which is a big bike race in Southern California. And she was going to race there, and I think the time trial stage is at 7,000 feet. So we were looking for a place where we could live at least 4,000 feet for a few months before, a couple months before the race. And I posted on Slowtwitch I was looking for a place to park the RV if anybody knew Southern California where we could go. And then Mark Montgomery, Monty on Slowtwitch, got on there and said the address at the bottom of the page is open. And I was like, what does he mean by that? I didn't know who Mark Montgomery was. He's like best buds with the founder of Slowtwitch, Dan Empfield. And the address at the bottom of the page is their address. They live right next door to each other in Southern California, and it's at 4,200 feet. And so I checked it out, and the next day we drove our RV there and parked. So I stayed with Dan and Mark for several months. Got to know their dogs, went on lots of runs and bikes. And yeah, I think at some point after that, they invited me to start writing, but I think they were cautious at first because it's kind of hard to believe how serendipitous that was.
But it's also it's also kind of interesting about how open they are to one, how quickly that moved. But again, that page is massive. If people, slowtwitch.com, but then just how small of a world it is too. Like, hey, just the address is right there, come check it out. And then it's all kind of clicking. So I'm curious. So you have your background is really fascinating, and it's incredibly diverse, right? You have a PhD, you have your bachelor's in kinesiology, bobsledder, decathletes, obviously track and field, road cyclist, and it's kind of like a do everything. Like you can just your knowledge base is again, like I said, is pretty fascinating. So yeah, I think that's pretty awesome. And you also just developed an app, like a nutrition app for your Saturday morning. And so can you kind of run through like what that app does, what the purpose and the thinking behind that app is?
It's basically, it's solving all the problems that I saw that athletes were having with nutrition for their training and nutrition for their races. So it's basically an elite nutrition coach in your pocket. So it tries to put everything that I know, and we will continue to develop it. But it's really puts everything that I know into an app and makes it accessible in your kitchen so that you know how to prep your bottles or prep your hydration pack if you're going on a long run. We've gotten really good feedback from a lot of folks. It's been really humbling, honestly, to see the feedback on Slowtwitch and Trainer Road, and of course in our member hub. It's been really, really humbling for both Michelle and I.
So like, is it essentially like a day-to-day where you're talking about, you enter kind of like your training and then you're then saying, this is what we're recommending for nutrition for this kind of a workout? Like, is that kind of it's like a day-to-day, not just a one kind of hit. It takes you through your training on a daily basis to what you're inputting.
Yeah, you just input your training. It asks you how long you're going, how hard you're going, how much you think you're going to sweat. Of course, there's an onboarding that asks you a bunch of information about yourself so that we can sort of calibrate, personalize all the nutrition recommendations to you specifically. And then it outputs, how much carbohydrate you need, how much sodium you need, how much fluid you need. And it helps you actually get that in your bottle, because that's the hard part. Is if I tell somebody, please put 120 grams of carbs and 1,200 milligrams of sodium and 1.2 liters of water in a bottle, and they're listening to this podcast, they're like, I can't immediately visualize how to do that. But the app takes you through step by step, says this many servings of this product, etc.
Yeah, and I've never seen an app like that. And I typically am pretty aware of things like this, and sort of I'm curious, like, how long did it take to develop something like this, like app building, data putting? I mean, it has to be pretty incredible.
It has been in development since October 28th of 2021. So we took about 1.5 years to launch, just because, app development is hard. Algorithmizing all of the scenarios that a person could run across and all of the like variability in humans. Like we're very different. Like 110-pound, highly trained marathon runner is a very different person from a new 212-pound triathlete, and their training demands are very different. It's been a fun task. But the cool thing is we've got like a year and 3 months of beta testing now. So we got the algorithms out very quickly in a really, really ugly app, really kind of hard to use app. We got them out really quickly and started testing for almost since the start. And Michelle, I think like our golden moment was when Michelle didn't want to train without the app anymore. That was like, okay, we know we have something here.
That's cool. Sweet. All right, let's get in a little bit of rapid fire here, so people can get a broader sense of you. So, what is your favorite sport of all the sports in the world? Doesn't have to be some bike or run, but like, what sport do you really love?
Gosh, that's a hard question. I've done so many. I mean, I like speed. I think anything that will give me speed. It could be. I like epic things too. Like I think cycling does a lot of that.
Yeah. You
can ride for 10 hours or you can descend a mountain for 5 minutes at 60 miles an hour. But that's hard to say. Bobsledding comes with a rush. That's pretty neat. Downhill mountain biking or enduro. I don't necessarily like doing flips, and I don't need to like be a world tour downhill rider, but I think enduro might be really fun. But in terms of what I actually do the most, I love cross-country mountain biking and I love road cycling.
Cool. And so what is your favorite event to watch?
Oh gosh, these are hard. Favorite event to watch. Crit racing is fun. I think if we can combine that with triathlon somehow, that'd be cool.
Yeah. What is your favorite sports nutrition product?
The Saturday app.
Okay, what is a favorite sports nutrition you can eat or drink?
Got it. I'm going to go with. I'm gonna say 2 of them: sugar and salt.
What is the last book that you read?
Oh goodness. High output management by the, I can't remember his position. I think he might be the chief operating officer of Intel.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Who is a great Twitter follower?
A great Twitter follower, as in
Or
somebody
Instagram follower.
to follow on Instagram or Twitter?
What's that?
As in somebody to follow on, I should recommend.
Yeah.
Dr. Tim Podlegar.
Yeah. So I want to, we'll come back to that. If you're at a gas station, you're on your bike, you are totally smashed and you're bonked, what are you grabbing?
Oh, Gatorade. Or any other really sugary, low carbonation beverage.
Nice. If you're doing a bike workout, would you rather go out and do zone 2 for hours, or would you rather go out and smash out some VO2 max intervals?
I would rather do sprints and then zone 2.
Okay. Oh, interesting. All right. What is your pre-race breakfast or pre-workout food?
Oatmeal, blueberries, lots of sugar if I have a big training session, because you just have to get it in. You have to get a lot of carbs in, and you can't do it with just strict oatmeal. Yeah, little nutmeg.
Okay. 3 more. So if you're going to have lunch with 3 people, who are they going to be?
My wife, that's Michelle. Let's see. Gosh, I should have prepared for this. Lunch with 3 people. Dan Emfield is a fascinating man. Really creative mind. And gosh, there's some names that come to mind that like have divisive, I would say are relatively divisive, but I think that's some of the allure. Maybe Thomas Sowell.
Thomas Sowell?
Yeah, he's an economist.
Oh, okay. Interesting. What do you think, in your opinion, is a waste of time? Well, let's keep this to endurance sports. A waste of time.
Good. Carb periodization.
Wow. Okay. Biggest mistake you've made in your profession?
I prescribed a 200-pound man 75 grams of carbs for a 4-hour bike ride.
Total. There we go.
That was terrible. He was no longer my client after that. Deservedly so. This was very, very early on in my coaching career years ago.
So I want to go back to the Tim, how do you pronounce it? Podlegar?
Podlegar, yeah. So
I want to talk briefly on him, because he is incredibly fascinating, nutritionist, very, I don't like, he's outspoken, but he likes to talk his opinion. He's incredibly intelligent. Now he's one of the sports dietitians, nutritionists for Boar Hansgrove. So obviously incredibly intelligent. So like, what is it about him that you find interesting?
I think he's one of the most honest researchers in nutrition. He's not swayed by company funding yet. All the good ones end up being hired by GlaxoSmithKline or Pepsi or Nestle.
You mean, so like he's not, what he's saying is basically, you see papers that all of a sudden you find, like if you see like a ketone study and all of a sudden find out that ketone study was funded by a ketone company, that it's going to be a little biased, and Tim's not biased.
Or massively biased. Yeah, and Tim is just ruthlessly unbiased. I love that.
Yeah, he is a great follow, no doubt. Well, cool. So let's get into this. So I mean, the biggest goal of this whole talk is going to be setting up one's race, mainly race nutrition and hydration plan, and really diving deep into how do you start this process with hydration, how do you start the process with carbohydrates, and taking you through mistakes that we've seen make, and also just how to really make sure that when you get to race day for like a 70.3 or an Ironman, that you have practiced it and also have like a good target for all these things. And also, I guess, how to be flexible with it. So starting with, let's start with hydration in terms of like, how does one start formulating a hydration plan for their race in terms of just like how much fluid they're intaking? How would one start there?
Good question. The first place to look is how much fluid intake have you felt good consuming during similar conditions in your training. I think the next thing is be familiar with the total, like the ranges of acceptability for total fluid intake. That means like in almost no circumstances are you ever going to intake less than 300 mils or like 12 ounces per hour. And almost no circumstances would you ever intake more than 2 liters per hour. And most people never more than like 1.5 liters per hour. That's like 48 ounces, 50 ounces. Yeah, know the like first draw the limits or understand the limits of what most humans can tolerate. And then, yeah, start dialing in what has worked for you in similar conditions.
So I'm curious, is there a maximal limit to how much fluid somebody can try to push an hour?
Yes, there is, and it is so widely variable. It's hard to give one number. People just vary so much.
Yeah, and so when you're looking at like in terms of hydration, then looking a little bit more into sodium. So can we talk a little bit more about sodium recommendations? Well, actually going back, so in terms of like, say I'm 160 pounds, and so like I mean it. So I recommend my athletes, if they're going to be inside, because a lot of my athletes are inside right now, that they're weighing themselves before and after. And let's just call it like it's a zone 2 ride, and they're mainly riding around 65 to 75%. Like, is that a helpful tool for people to use to finding how much sweat they're losing per hour?
Yeah, if people have the time to weigh themselves before and after and figure out how much they lost, do the math on how much they took in, how much they lost during, do some estimation, that is valuable. And the goal should be to basically, the longer you go, the longer your training session, the lower the rate of loss should be. You should try to, and the longer you go, the more on top of it you need to stay at the beginning. And so, like, for example, if you are going to go 5 hours and you're going to target like a 1% body weight loss, it might be ideal to almost match your fluid losses in the first 2 or 3 hours while sweat rates are lower, because as the day heats up, you're going to just be required to lose some, because your sweat rate will actually exceed your intake ability, your gut tolerance.
And so I looked at that. So that's about, so for me, for at 160, that's about 1.5 pounds that you're like aiming to, like, nice. Aiming to lose. And so then looking more into sodium, because like, I mean, how does one even start to determine how much sodium one is losing? Because again, like you always hear this, you can just go to a lab. Well, most people don't have access to a lab. And so when you're looking at people who don't have a laboratory to go to, or like a precision hydration or like a leveling kind of test, like, I guess, how do people even start? And what are your recommendations for like for sodium intake?
Yeah, so you could spend lots of money on sweat testing, but for sweat testing to be useful and something that you can extrapolate to your future training sessions, it has to be done really, really regularly, and it has to be highly reliable, and that doesn't exist. Like, short of literally living inside of a sports science lab, all of the sort of like biosensors such and such aren't accurate enough to be any more useful than just knowing basic ranges of sodium loss and sort of getting a feel for how much you personally sweat, and the salt content of your sweat. So if you are a heavy sweater, you will find that you might sweat like 1 to 2 liters per hour, Um, sorry, I'm thinking about how I want to lay this out. If you're a heavy sweater, you might sweat 1 to 2 liters per hour, and if you're a light sweater, you might sweat maybe like half a liter per hour. And the way to check your sodium content of your sweat is just look at your body. Like if you're covered in salt, you are probably a saltier sweater. And it just so happens that heavier sweaters tend to be sometimes less salty sweaters. So like if you're the heavy sweating person, this is the analogy I always use. If you're the heavy sweating person, you will you don't have salt crystals all over your body when you're done with the workout, chances are you're not a very salty sweater. So start there, figure out if you are like saltier or less salty of a sweater, and then know the salt intake ranges that are optimal for most people, and then understand that the risk of over consuming sodium is much lower than the risk of under consuming sodium. Meaning, if you're going to err on one side, err on just consuming a little bit more sodium. So the ranges that are acceptable are like at the very bottom end for a long, let's say anything over 3 hours is like 300, 400, 500 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid that you consume. For longer session, or for higher sweat rates, sodium needs in each liter increase. So the more fluid you're consuming, the more sodium per liter you need to be consuming. So that might look like 1.5 liters per hour and like 1,500 milligrams or 1,000 milligrams per liter, which would put you at over 2,000 milligrams per hour of sodium consumed.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the things that you kind of mentioned in there is people who are sweating a lot of volume might not, like, how much sodium is within that sweat might be low. So people could say, well, I sweat 3 pounds an hour. And they could say, well, I'm just sweating a ton. It's like, yeah, you're sweating a lot of volume, but there might not be a lot of the sodium concentration. That sweat might be low, but then somebody could be sweating out 28 ounces, but their sweat concentration could be you're caked in it. And I think you need to be aware of both, not just one or the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm curious, like when you look at a nutrition product though, and like let's just call it well, let's just say like a tailwind or whatever. I mean, the sodium concentration levels on so many of these packages are always really low. I mean, I don't know of any like nutrition product that has, I mean, and again, I could be wrong, but like 1,000 milligrams or more. So like why do nutrition products not put more sodium within their products?
Good question. I think the answer has more to do with marketing than science. And I think the answer also has to do with customer retention more than science as well. That is, if you put 1,000 milligrams of sodium in a product, that's a little bit scary for people to hear that I'm going to be with this one scoop, I'm going to put 1 gram of sodium in my beverage, when sodium has a little bit of a bad rap in society. That's part one. I think part two is, if you do overdose sodium, the first effect that you will get is gut cramps or diarrhea or like bloating, discomfort, GI discomfort of some kind. And if you are a nutrition company and you give somebody GI discomfort with your product, you've lost that customer. That's probably reason number two that companies are pretty conservative with both their carb and sodium recommendations per serving.
And so I'm curious, like if somebody's working through a sweat plan, well, a sweat plan, like if they're working through like how much fluid they're trying to move through, and like how does the process go where somebody says, okay, I'm taking in, I sweat 1 liter, so I'm gonna try to take in 1 liter, but they're not quite sure on sodium. I mean, is it as simple of, I'm gonna start with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, and then I'm gonna do a before and after test, like in terms of like how much you lose, and then you do it again with 1,500 milligrams, and then you might lose a little bit less? Like, is that how somebody would want to approach determining how much sodium is too much or too little?
Yeah, really good question. So the let's look at the lower end. Let's look at how do we know if I'm intaking too little sodium. The first indicator is you're drinking a lot and peeing a lot and still thirsty. If you have thirst and you're peeing, it means you're literally just you're creating yourself, you're making yourself a giant tube pouring water through, and that the water is going in one end and out the other. So the way that we get our body to actually hold on to the water that we're consuming and pull it out of our gut and into our bloodstream and retain it for blood volume is we add sodium. So if you have, if you are like experiencing frequent urination, stopping more often on your rides or runs than you want to, that's probably sign number one that you should increase your sodium intake. On the other end is how do we know when we've kind of reached that I've had too much sodium? GI distress. That's the first thing. It's not going to be like blood pressure. Now, I will say, if you have pre-existing high blood pressure, unmitigated high blood pressure, and you're like, you don't have it controlled with medication or whatever, please don't go slam a bunch of sodium. But if you have regular blood pressure or you're on blood pressure medication and your doctor has cleared you to do sport, then you can consume relatively high sodium during training. And the first symptom of doing too much is gut distress.
Interesting. And so I think the last part on the sodium aspect is most people, if they're just using basic products, well, if one is going to use more sodium, I mean, are all the products kind of created equal for, I'm going to add on 500 more milligrams, I'm going to add on 1,000 more milligrams? I mean, are there products that are, we don't have to name the specific ones, but are there ones that you would recommend for the best path to go with that, adding on?
Yeah, good question. I would have to check to see which like commercially available endurance products are using sodium citrate or a combination of sodium citrate with table salt or sodium chloride. But in general, what folks need to be looking for is if I'm consuming really high sodium, like more than 1,200 milligrams per hour, or even if you're just bumping it up to 800 milligrams per hour and you've generally done low sodium consumption in the past, or if you just have like are concerned about gut issues, sodium citrate is the way to mitigate gut issues because it just sits better in your gut. It's fewer total ions in solution, which means it's less likely to pull more water into your gut, and it's less likely to overload you on chloride ions. So if you get too many chloride ions in your gut, it tends not to be very happy. So yeah, sodium citrate for higher sodium intake scenarios is a really good bet.
I mean, and just asking in general, I mean, is that easy to purchase? I mean, is that something you can just like buy off of Amazon or go off of like Google and just buy it, and just, you're basically topping it off of a water bottle is what you're saying?
Yeah, totally. Get a teaspoon out. There's 1,000 milligrams of sodium per teaspoon of sodium citrate. And yeah, you can buy it on Amazon. There's many brands on Amazon. And if you're not sure, they'll probably be marketing it as a cheese emulsifier.
Actually, one more question on this. So I want to talk about sodium. I just want to ask a question about sodium pills, like, so when those, one, would you recommend that as a way to go? And two, how long do you think it takes for when you actually swallow that pill to when it actually, how quickly does it actually absorb to be useful for your body? Because I always wonder about that. And someone's like, yeah, I took a salt pill and I felt better 20 minutes later. I mean, is that accurate, or is it just like a placebo kind of a thing?
Gosh, that is a good question. There's definitely a placebo aspect there. There's no doubt that part of that is placebo. If you're feeling a salt pill, then you are like massively under sodiumed for your training session. The only scenarios where you might feel a salt pill are if you have been intaking virtually no sodium with high carbs. You could have sort of like a carb backup in your gut because you do need some sodium in the gut to facilitate carb absorption. but we're talking about really extremes there. You'd have to be really almost intentionally limiting sodium to find that scenario. So I would say the best option is just use the fluid, or use fluid-based sodium, meaning putting the powder, the sodium citrate granules, just straight up in your drink. It won't affect the taste. If anything, it'll make it taste better because it will cut down on the sweetness. And usually when you get really hot, sweaty, tired, folks don't want hyper sweet beverages. So sodium citrate can be used to like bring down the sweetness. As far as like the delay time of absorbing a sodium pill, it probably adds 10 to 20 minutes, and that's totally a guess. Don't quote me.
Yeah. Hate to do this again. I have one more follow-up question to that. And this goes a little bit more into one's diet with how much sodium one is putting in versus how much potential sweat, how much sodium concentration is within their sweat. So one, are the two related, where if I'm very plant-based and I just don't put a lot of natural sodium within my diet, does that correlate to my sweat concentration, to how much I'm losing? Let's start there.
Sure. Yeah. So if you consume a low sodium diet, you are more likely to experience two things. One, a low sodium content of your sweat. And two, you're more likely to be that person who struggles with frequent urination in your training sessions. Like it's usually like the red flags in my email inbox that somebody is going to like struggle with consuming sufficient fluid because they are going to be frustrated by how frequently they have to stop to pee. Is they look really healthy, they talk about health, they talk about nutrition and that being natural, organic, like sometimes vegetarian, vegan, but mostly it's like a natural focus. Those folks tend to find that if they drink the amounts that I recommend and that are recommended to maintain optimal hydration, they're like, I can't stop peeing. And I'm like, well, did you increase the sodium yet? Because you consume like an almost no sodium diet already. You need to increase your intra workout sodium.
Interesting. Okay, let's get into carbohydrates. So we'll just start with like a general range that you would suggest, or you kind of, well, let's just talk about a range of carbohydrates one should be taking for a 7.3 to an Ironman.
That is a really good question. I would say the broadest possible range that I would ever recommend that would capture all people. The lowest end, 60 grams per hour, and at the highest end, 155 grams per hour. But I don't think I would ever actually recommend 155 grams per hour on the run. And I don't think the race average would ever be that high. So let's draw a more realistic range. Almost all people should fall between 70 to 75 and 120 to 130 grams of carbs per hour for half Ironman or full Ironman.
Okay. And then I think we talk about hydration scaring people. I think people hear those numbers and either they're confused or they're like, yep, I know this, or they're very scared to take in that much. And how much of that is like size dependent? So again, I think again, like this has been like talked about, where if I weigh 160 pounds, my carbohydrate intake should be this. But with how much sugar we're talking about, does size and body weight determine carb intake?
Yeah, really good question. Two things here. I think we need to like really reiterate that if you're listening to this and you're feeling like, okay, that sounds like an insane amount, I'm not even anywhere close to that. That's normal. That's the normal response when most people hear numbers like 80 grams of carbs per hour. Like it's really normal, unless you've been doing 60 or 70. 80 sounds just absurd if you've been doing like 30 or 40 grams per hour, or maybe you're not tracking how many carbs per hour you've been doing. You're not even thinking about it in those terms. You're like, I take a gel maybe every hour. If you're that person and you look at your gel and you see it's 22 grams of carbs, like, yes, it sounds like a lot, but you may be surprised how much it helps you perform. The second thing is how much is it size dependent? Way less than people think. It is much more dependent on the level of fitness that the person has and the level of absolute power or absolute energy expenditure on the run that that person is outputting. And so the first thought that most people have when they hear that is, well, I'm a small person, so I probably don't have very high absolute power, so maybe I don't need that many carbs. That's not true. If you can do a half Ironman, you probably can do enough power to merit pretty much maxing out your gut tolerance regardless. So it's very easy for a just average fitness person to need or benefit from at least 75 grams per hour, like a 100-pound person. And I'll just give the anecdote of my wife. She's 130, 140 pounds, under 140 pounds. And she, to optimize her performance, needs to consume bare minimum 120 to 125 grams per hour.
And I think, I'm just trying to think of which direction to take this, but I think the one thing is that with, say, a smaller athlete, is that with what we know of sugars and using multiple sources of sugars, is that somebody who weighs 120 pounds or 110 pounds, with how much they can take in, is actually closer to their caloric burn than somebody who's like 180 pounds, right? Where, say, if they're riding and their kgs per hour is 450, kilojoules per hour, or 500 kilojoules per hour, like they're more likely to match their loss versus somebody who's expending 800 kilojoules per hour. You know what I mean? But let's go to, like, because I think it's very important to set this up, where carbohydrates, we're talking about larger quantities, less than 60. And so we're talking about dual source carbohydrates to get above 60. So can you kind of get into why the dual source, like using two types of carbohydrates, and why some companies do and some companies don't use multiple sources of carbohydrates, and why that's important?
Yeah, totally. So the multiple source thing basically comes down to, you need to have both glucose and fructose in your carbohydrate fuel. And the reason for that is you have two sets of transporters in your gut. One set allows your gut to transport glucose from your gut to your bloodstream where you need it. And the bloodstream obviously feeds the muscles. And the other set is for fructose. The other set of transporters in your gut is for fructose. And then there's a set of transporters for fructose that is actually, that works better in the presence of glucose. So that's why fructose is becoming more and more agreed upon as well evidenced and as beneficial as a part of your fueling strategy. You need glucose and fructose, and you need to probably be very near to a 1-to-1 ratio of those two sugars to optimize your gut comfort and to optimize your performance.
So then are there types of sugars that one should avoid when they're training and racing?
Everything else.
Okay. And then
I can clarify on that if you want.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there are other sugar and carbohydrate types that contain glucose or are glucose sources or are fructose sources. And some of the most common ones are maltodextrin, is a pure glucose source. Fructose can also be found in sucrose, which is table sugar. So if you just have table sugar, that's why sugar was my favorite product when you asked in our rapid fire. Sugar is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. That's a 1-to-1 ratio of glucose and fructose, which is optimal. Some folks like maltodextrin like to add a little bit of that so that they can hit that, if they've heard of the 1-to-0.8 ratio that is making the rounds, just because there was a study in 2017 that popularized it. You can do that by adding 1/8 of your solution as maltodextrin, with the rest of it being from sugar, table sugar.
So you said that, I mean, essentially, if I go to my local pharmacy, my local grocery store, and I go buy sugar, that's going to be essentially a 1-to-1 ratio. So when I look at like a product like Never Second or Morton, or like some of those $4 per serving, like what is that ratio?
They are at that 1 to 0.8 ratio, and Yeah, that's it's very close to 1-to-1. And I think they do that because it's hard to sell sugar to you at $4 a gel. It's much easier if they say it's a fancy science, such and such. And actually, I take it back. Never Second is still using 2-to-1, and they have branded it AJ21 for Ask Her You Can Drip. Because he's sort of like the godfather of sport nutrition or intra-workout nutrition for endurance athletes. Really pushed the field forward back in the early 2000s. And he was the one who sort of really pioneered the 2-to-1 multiple transportable carbohydrate idea. But yeah, he still uses that 2-to-1.
So it's kind of interesting. So when people, and again, when I talk to people about this and people watch your YouTube videos, I think people have a hard time really understanding that when you're buying Gatorade or you're buying a lot of these sports nutrition products, that it's basically virtually the same thing, like pretty close. And so you're saying, well, I don't want to drink, I don't like putting sugar into my bottle. I'm like, well, what do you think these other nutrition products are? Right? Like they're marketed a little bit more professionally than just going and buying sugar at my Hy-Vee. But
yes,
I mean, so, but if you were to design like a nutrition product, I mean, are you essentially buying like a measuring scale and you're saying, I'm going to take in 90 grams of this sugar. Then you're just going to add your sodium citrate to it. I mean, is there anything else you would add or anything like you would change off of how many grams per hour you're looking to put in there?
yeah, I mean, yeah, the sugar is going to be based on how hard you're going and how long you're going. So how many carbs per hour is based on how long and how hard you're going. And then the salt is going, or the sodium is going to be based on how much you're sweating and sort of like what you know about yourself in terms of how salty of a sweater you are. And then, yeah, add flavoring. I mean, there's some folks like actually don't mind the taste of just sugar and salt. I call me soft, but I have to have flavoring. I usually add like a little bit of commercial product just because they have good flavorings that have been tested.
Like what? Like what kind of stuff do you add into yours?
I mean, Gatorade's the cheapest, but I think you might even be able to go even cheaper if you do like lemon juice, because you need so little of it. You can just put a little squirt of lemon juice in with sugar and salt. But I think you can really add just about any product, like Infinite Jet Fuel, Morton, whatever you want. It's all just going to effectively be flavoring if you're doing it right, because you should be optimizing with mostly sugar and salt or sodium citrate.
And you're just taking into account as you're measuring this out before you put it into a bottle of like 80 grams of sugar, 10, 20 more grams of this other product that they might use.
Yeah.
Now, this seems to be a trend where people will use a quote unquote slow releasing carbohydrate with a faster burning carbohydrate. So like, what's your take on slower burn carbs mixed with sugar or a Morton or something like that?
Yeah. My take is that is the number one way to give yourself GI distress. And that if you are consuming a slow burn carb and not experiencing GI distress, you are under consuming carbohydrate. And you could have better performance if you consumed more carbohydrate and it was faster carbohydrate.
And what's the rationale behind that? Like, why would somebody think that they need to be taking a quote unquote slower releasing carbohydrate compared to a faster carbohydrate?
Really good question. I think, honestly, it's a really admirable and like reasonable rationale. You're doing a race that's long. It's slow. Like, it's not necessarily slow, but like compared to like a 5,000 meter run, an Ironman is a slow, long effort, and there's a lot of fat burning that needs to happen, a lot. And so it kind of makes sense that you just want to keep your blood sugar nice and steady. And so therefore I will take this sort of like slow burning carb, slow absorption carb. But it's much, much better to take faster burning carbs and just consume more of them. And you will have better gut tolerance by doing that. And I think the reason that folks end up moving from faster burning carbs to slower burning carbs over the course of a career, sometimes they decide to start using slower burning stuff, because the reason is they experience that blood sugar crash sometime in the middle of a race, and they're like, man, this product that's all sugar just makes me so up and down. It's like I'm powering up, and then I'm hypoglycemic and I'm totally bonking. And it's simply because there are delays in their consumption. So they might like consume once every 40 minutes or once every 25 minutes. And so you get these big ups and downs. But if you just consume your faster carbs once every 15 minutes or 10 minutes, or just sip regularly, yeah, you won't have that up and down at all.
And I think I want to go back just for a hot second, because like what kind of sugars are being used in a slow burning, like a UCAN, right? I mean,
Yeah.
And when you put in a slower burning carb, and we're talking about faster absorbing carbohydrates, which is what people would want. I mean, does somehow those longer chain carbohydrates slow the absorption of the glucose, fructose that you're putting in? Is that essentially so? It's like it's blocking it in a sense.
Yeah, your gut is essentially working harder to absorb those things. More resources are being diverted to absorb more complex things. And mostly what's happening is it's just sitting in your gut longer. And so eventually the concentration of the carbohydrate in your gut increases to the extent that your gut is no longer happy. If you allow the concentration of carbohydrates in your gut to go too high, as it drifts up, you'll hit a threshold where your gut is like revolting, cramping, because you need to bring the concentration of those carbs down, which means consume less carbs and drink more water. Yeah, so it's a 2-for-1 no. And the things that people might like, the words that you might look for on the back of a nutrition product to see if there are slow burning things in them, it would be anything that says starch, anything that says like complex carb. I'll come back to that in a second. And then anything like galactose is slow. It's like 4.5 times slower than glucose. I think isomaltulose or something like that. But sometimes companies will say complex carb, like for the long haul or something like that, and it'll be maltodextrin. And maltodextrin technically is it pains me to call it a complex carb. It is a glucose polymer. It's all stranded together, glucose all in a chain. And same thing with highly branched cyclic dextrin or just branched dextrin or whatever dextrin thing you see. Those are all just glucose polymers that are stuck together, and they work just like glucose at their best. So it's funny when companies call them complex carbs because they're not actually any slower.
And so let's talk about and then going into let's talk about the people who say, I need to have my Uncrustable, I need to have I'm going to be out there forever. I'm doing an Ironman, and I'm going to be on the bike for 6.5 to 7.5 hours, and I'm just going to be starving. I need to have my pretzels and my sandwiches. I mean, which then in theory they're combining more fiber. They're going to be putting fat into their race nutrition plan, like maybe a little bit of protein. But I mean, is that a good strategy? Would you recommend that for people who are out there much longer in like a more race environment, or is that just again increasing one's chance of getting GI discomfort?
Yeah, totally. So if you are hungry and it feels like you must have solid food to satiate your hunger, you are way behind on your carbohydrate fueling, because there are hormonal mechanisms that happen during exercise, especially during strenuous exercise, that strongly block the signaling of hunger. So if you're feeling that hunger, you have epinephrine coursing through your blood that is also telling your brain, don't feel the hunger, which means if you're feeling it, you're way behind on fueling. You're way hypocaloric, and you're probably hundreds of grams of carbs behind on where you should be for that event. So if you're feeling like you need to eat the solid food, really ask yourself the hard question of, is it just because I enjoy solid food, or is it because I'm actually feeling hunger and I need to satiate that hunger? If it's the hunger thing, consider just consuming more liquid carbs faster, earlier in the event. In terms of the content of that solid food, yeah, fat, fiber, and protein are a no-go. Like, they will slow down everything in your gut, and they will cause way higher rates of GI distress.
And then what makes the people have, like, they get off the bike and they're sloshing in their stomach? I mean, where does that symptom come from?
Yeah, sometimes that's from consuming too high of a concentration of fuel, but it can also be the opposite. It can be from too much fluid and maybe not enough sodium sometimes. That's a tough one. It depends on the other symptoms that they're having. If they're experiencing swelling in their like fingers, toes, or legs, yeah, definitely need to increase sodium.
Some companies I see, it's like a consistent where they are adding protein. And I know we kind of just talked about this, but it's like a constant. You need to have protein if you're doing this. Like it's and what is, like, again, like what is the reasoning behind the protein? Like, is it a hunger thing? I mean, like I still don't get my mind about like why is that an element of people's nutrition plan?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's an element of people's nutrition plans because exercise scientists really want to find that thing that people can take or add to their plan to really give them that next performance edge. And so they do lots of silly studies on things that are very tangential and like way kind of out there. And so, yes, the best argument for it is there might be some sort of cognitive benefit of having some level of BCAA consumption or some tiny level, like 1 gram or 2 grams per hour of certain amino acids. It might improve cognitive drive, but we're talking about, I mean, there's probably 12 other things I would take before that. So I would not do that. In terms of that I've seen, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're good.
I was going to say, in terms of other arguments I've seen marketing agent or marketing like cup brands give for putting protein in products. Yeah, like keeping a hunger at bay during long rides, or like better recovery or less muscle breakdown during long training sessions or races. But no, none of that's real.
And so if one falls behind, because like I think we're talking about carbohydrates, and it's important that we kind of keep that hydration element in there as well, because without the hydration kind of almost being like the backbone to the plan, like you can take in these high carbs, but at some point like the GI stress might really, that's where it's going to hinder the plan. But if you get low on liquid, like if your hydration status lowers, can that make you feel more hungry and then overconsume carbs, and then that'll push on more GI stress, or is that not the way it'll work?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that hydration, like a reduced hydration, would cause increased hunger, but it can certainly, like if you get behind on your fueling plan overall, let's say you have a mix that you're consuming and it contains all of your carbs and all of your fluid. If you're behind on consuming that, there might come a time where you do get hungry and dehydrated. And the trouble with falling behind is that, yes, if you're dehydrated, your gut starts to function less well, which means you actually have even less ability to consume carbs and fluid now because your gut won't tolerate it. So dehydration means you are actually in a worse position to make it up. It's like double bad, because now you can't even match the intake rate that would be optimal normally, but you actually need to increase your intake rate to higher than optimal because you're behind, but you can't even meet optimal.
Yeah, and which is interesting, right? Because I think this is where like higher carbohydrate intake gets the can get a bad rap, versus like I tried to do this but it didn't work for me. Yes. And they're blaming the carbohydrate aspect of it. But when in doubt, if their hydration consumption reduced, their gut gets vulnerable, but they're still putting it in, and they get the GI discomfort. And then the worst thing happens, right? They say, I'm gonna reduce my carbohydrates because I don't want to get GI discomfort. And then they start to think, well, maybe I want to go maybe a lot more of a low carbohydrate, so I don't need as many carbohydrates to somehow work that off. But again, like when you're burning 400 to 500 to 600 to 800 calories kgs per hour, reducing carbohydrates is probably the worst thing you could do yes. for a 10 to 16 hour event,
Yep, totally. And it's like, I think that it's that carbohydrate sensitivity that comes from dehydration that turns people on to the slower carbs at first. And that's the same thing that I think turns a lot of people on to, or makes keto attractive to a lot of folks. Because easily the best argument against good carbohydrate fueling during a race is it's a little bit hard to implement. It's the logistics side of things. It works straight up, it works. But you can mess it up, and if you mess it up, there are risks. Like if you underconsume, you can get hypoglycemic. If you underhydrate, you can get GI distress. So that's why folks end up turning to something else, because they've experienced those risks, and then there are less acute sort of like punch you in the face consequences of doing keto in a race. Like if you do keto in a race, you're not going to feel all of a sudden like you bonked. You'll just be slow. And I'm being a little bit facetious there. The difference between keto and good carb fueling is not as big as all of the exercise scientists would like you to believe. And I'll shoot very straight. There are obviously very fast keto athletes. Dan Plews has like obviously a great following for a reason. But yeah, the evidence is really clear that like a low carb approach will not beat a higher carb approach when they're implemented with the same quality of implementation.
Yeah, you bring up Dan Plews, and I think that's an interesting. It's kind of like an N1, right? Where he's a tremendous athlete. I mean, when you look at the articles that he wrote leading into when he set the Kona record, his training hours were incredible. Like he was training like a professional athlete, And I think a lot of people don't have that kind of time to train, which then feeds into one's ability just to be so strong, so I want two more things on questions on this is what's this blanket at? We want somebody to take in 400 calories an hour carbohydrates for a 5 to 6 hour Ironman bike.
Mm-hmm.
Where do people put this? Because that's a lot of carbohydrates. It's a lot of calories. So where does one even put all of these carbs? Because
yeah, good question. Like I said, the logistics of doing this is the best argument. That's like the best argument to go any other route. But yeah, it's honestly quite simple. You put it in 2 bottles. You put all your carbs in 2 bottles in concentrate form, and then that's one method. And then fill with water as you go. Grab water from every aid station, and then basically you're sipping a concentrate, and it's like a much easier and faster to swallow and easier to consume thing than a gel, because it's still very drinkable. It's like a liquid. It's just a sweet liquid, salty sweet liquid. Option 2 is like carry baggies of powder and fill, but like baggies just drive me nuts, so I don't generally recommend that. Yeah,
it seems kind of easy.
It seems kind of easy to do. Yeah, I mean, that's what most of my clients end up doing.
Yeah. But I mean, I think the simplicity of that is almost like it's too easy for people. Well, I can just put all of this into 2 bottles, like one half, second half, and I think that's just gonna be too easy for people. It's like there has to be more to putting in that much carbohydrate. Yeah. So essentially, you have what's just called like a first half bottle, but then like you said, then you're picking up the water off of the course.
Mm-hmm.
So really 3 water bottle cages, potentially, maybe 4, right? But like, yeah. The one thing that I didn't add, but I'm glad I thought of it, is caffeine. So caffeine, let's just talk about it during the event. I guess what's your general thoughts on how much caffeine to take during a race, and where to place it within the bike and the run, good places, bad places, that kind of a thing?
Yeah, first thing is to know the basics about caffeine. So 5 to 6 hour half-life is like what we say the population average is, but it ranges like 4 to 8 hours, but roughly let's call it 6 hours. That means, and it peaks in your bloodstream about an hour after you take it, maybe 45 minutes after you take it. That means that you should be taking some of it before the race, maybe 3 milligrams per kilogram. So that would be for me like, oh my goodness, roughly 250 milligrams before a race. So a caffeine pill is fine. 2 cups of coffee, 2.5 cups of coffee is fine. Make sure to have some salt with it, because you don't want to be drinking 0 salt fluid just before your race. So salt your eggs in the morning if you're having eggs or pancakes or whatever. Yeah, during the race, maybe 50 milligrams per hour, 75 milligrams per hour. assuming this person is like a regular caffeine consumer. If you're just somebody who's like, I never consume caffeine, I don't drink coffee, or maybe I have 1 cup of coffee per day or black tea or something, and that's all the caffeine you ever consume, then you might be just fine with like 30 to 40 milligrams per hour during the race, and that would be plenty. Like you'd feel great. But because the half-life is 5 to 6 hours, you need to consume it earlier in the race. Like it will build up in your system. So you could probably shut down caffeine consumption like 2 or 3 hours before the end of the race, and it will still be like working very effectively through the end of the run.
Can you overconsume? I mean, it seems really dumb to ask this
Sure,
question,
yeah.
but can you overconsume? And if you do overconsume caffeine in a race, like what kind of symptoms will you feel?
Okay, real world. I think the number one sign of overconsumption of caffeine is actually that you stop consuming everything else by choice, or you forget, because the psychological effects of consumption of caffeine are you love to suffer, you love to push into the pain, and you lose any sign of hunger, any sign of thirst. You just kind of want to push. And so if you can also just override that and be on a scheduled drinking or scheduled consumption schedule. So there's not a huge risk of, excuse me, I've got notifications going here. There's not a huge risk of overconsumption because you can just say, I'm going to stick to my plan, my nutrition plan. But if you're not super self-aware or really tracking that, it's easy to get into this place where you're like, oops, I forgot to consume because I was feeling so good. But yeah, I mean, overconsumption, gosh, to be honest, you have to consume a lot of caffeine to be in the overconsumption range. Like, yeah,
cool. Okay, awesome. So let's talk about fueling leading into the race. And I mean, this again, I think is where areas in which athletes can definitely make some serious mistakes in terms of, I mean, in my experience, just people not eating enough carbohydrates into it. So are the days still alive where, this is way back to lower running, where you do a carb depletion into a carb load, like a super compensation? Like, does that still exist, or is it a 3-day? Is it a 1-day? Like, what is the carb loading, if any, happen?
Yeah, definitely no need to deplete carbohydrates. And I think the trade-offs of depleting carbohydrates are way higher than any benefit of like super compensation, which we're not even sure happens in the real world. So no, don't deplete carbohydrates. Yes, carb loading is effective, especially for like half Ironman and Olympic distance. It's probably more effective for those than for Ironman, but also is effective for Ironman too. Basically, day before, 2 days before, 3 days before, consume a lot more carbs. And consume carbs, this is the most important point, consume carbs that you're familiar with, that your gut's familiar with, that you know sits well, and that you know feel good the next days afterwards, having consumed them. Don't go consume like a pound of pasta if you haven't had pasta in a month or 2 months and you're not sure how it works for you. Honestly, simpler is often better. So like low-fat ice cream, if you love dairy and dairy sits well with you, is a great one. Or just like double your workout fueling in the final days. But the goal is like, we're talking about hundreds of grams of carbs more for the 2 or 3 days leading into the race. And generally I recommend doing it before like 5 or 6 p.m. so that you're not disturbing your sleep.
Can say if you're like somebody who likes to have dinner late, if you have too many carbohydrates too late the night before the race, can that somehow carry into the morning and provide GI stress for the race day?
Maybe.
Or if they eat the wrong food too much?
Yeah, it could, if it's like a high fiber carb source. Yeah, for sure it could. I think if you're using simpler stuff, definitely get simpler as you go towards race day, for sure.
You seemed a little hesitant toward carbohydrate loading for an Ironman. Like you said, definitely for an Olympic, definitely for a half, but maybe, you didn't say maybe not, but it wasn't like for the full 100%. So like, is there any reason not to take in as many carbohydrates leading into a full?
No, it's just not as big of a reason.
Huh.
So let me clarify. You should carb load for every triathlon.
Okay.
uh, it's just the performance benefit might be 1% for an Ironman and 1.5% for a half Ironman and Olympic distance.
And is that just because the burn rate, because you're going at an easier intensity that you're, if you're going at an Olympic, I mean, the carbohydrate distribution is probably up through the roof versus a full, you're not burning as many. Where is that the reasoning?
Actually, I think the biggest reason for not being able to tease out as big of a performance benefit from carb loading for an Ironman is Ironman performance is so dependent on intra-race fueling because it's so long that, yeah, failing or succeeding in your intra-race fueling like makes or breaks everything in an Ironman. You can like kind of get away with making mistakes in a half Ironman, but mistakes are generally pretty catastrophic in an Ironman.
Sticking to like the day before, 2 days before, 3 days before, are there ranges in which you think people should be shooting for in terms of just like carbohydrate intake?
Yes. Gosh, I would say if you're not adding at least 200 grams per day to what you would normally consume for the training that's happening on those final 3 days before your race, adding at least 200, but 300 or 400 grams per day is great. So that might put you at like 400 to 600 or 700 grams of carbs per day for those final 3 days.
600 grams of carbohydrates, that's 2,400 calories of just carbohydrates if you're shooting for 600. Yeah,
it's a lot.
Yeah.
I know that some folks
go.
expressed the concern that they might gain weight from that, and I would say any weight that you gain is beneficial weight because it is carbs and water stored in your muscles, and that's performance enhancing.
So basically, the day before the race, 2 days before the race, don't weigh yourself and freak yourself out that your watts per kilo are just like going plummeting, because it's not going to affect it.
Yeah, no, it will enhance it. Like you should, if you are a person who wants to weigh themselves and you don't mind seeing the weight go up, you should actually see, if you did it right, you should be 3 pounds heavier on race day.
Yeah, because it's liver glycogen, muscle glycogen, additional water. It's not body fat.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, sweet. Like somebody asked a question about best foods to have before the race, but you said stick to things that work, so don't all of a sudden change that. One thing that I've seen, and I just wanted to ask, is the morning of the race, should your breakfast be mainly carbohydrates? Is there reasons to have a bunch of eggs to quote unquote keep your fat burning roaring, or is it just get in the carbohydrates race morning to kind of like restock muscle glycogen and a little bit of liver glycogen?
Yeah, race morning should just be mostly carbohydrates. If you want to have like 20 grams of protein with it or something and maybe 5 or 10 grams of fat, that's totally fine. But you don't need to seek out protein, fiber, or fat. It's just about getting carbs in, and not so much just to replace or top off your glycogen. It's as much to elevate your blood sugar before the race, so that during your warm-up and during the swim, you have you have elevated blood sugar to start, and you also have carbohydrates being titrated from the gut into your bloodstream during those portions of the race and warm-up.
Cool. Okay. This is going to tie back nicely because in your rapid fire, you mentioned this, and it goes back to, because this is somebody asked this question, is carb periodization, the right fuel at the right time. Like for ease, if today is like a zone 1 day, stay away from the carbohydrates. I mean, like, because you said that, so let's talk a little bit about the periodization of carbohydrates within one's training.
Yeah, so carbohydrate periodization, I think, is a term that it was pioneered as a term that helped people get their minds around the idea of modifying carbs up and down based on the intensity of their training with the goal effect being to enhance fat burning or to enhance metabolic flexibility, which is this idea where you can burn carbs effectively and you can burn fat effectively, and you're efficient at both of those. That's like the premise behind carbohydrate periodization, and it's bogus. There's no evidence yet. There's no evidence yet that you can materially enhance fat burning by reducing carbs without having a greater decrease in carb burning ability. So basically, what you gain in fat burning ability, you lose more of in carb burning ability, and vice versa. Or rather, not vice versa. Excuse me. The other thing to note is the time course of these adaptations is such that, like, the fat burn gain that you get is more transient. It goes away faster than the carb burn loss that you get. So it's basically hurting you the more that you carb periodize. The one thing that it does do is it makes you feel tough as nails. Like when you do training sessions with low carbs, you feel tough mentally. So if there's a psychological benefit, then have at it. But just know that you're trading off your ability to absorb and oxidize carbohydrates.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like you wake up and you just naturally fasted, and you push through a fasted workout and you finished it. Granted, it was the worst session of your life, but you finished it. You're like, that's going to help me at mile 8 of my Ironman because I did this. It's like I think there's a lot more other components to that. I remember being at a conference and listening to somebody speak, and they were talking about the Grand Tour cyclists that they were working with, and how they went through a Grand Tour. I'm not going to say which one it was. And this famous cyclist, they were actually restricting carbohydrates and calories in the middle of a Grand Tour to help lose weight. But then somehow then toward like the pinnacle part of this Grand Tour, they put a ton of carbohydrates in. So somehow they were like weight manipulating to lose weight, which for me just sounds totally insane that this person's burning 5,000 to 6,000 kgs, 8,000 kgs a day, but they were restricting food because they needed to lose weight before Grand Tour. I'm like, well, why wasn't this athlete at this race weight leading into the Grand Tour?
That's a great question.
But they were talking about the carb periodization of like, this is what we were doing, look how great it is. But in reality, it seems a little bit mismanaged in that aspect.
Sure. So I want to point out one thing that I think people, when they hear don't carb periodize, they also hear you should have high carbs at every training session. And that's not what I'm saying. You should allow your carb intake to drop during zone 1 training, simply because you don't need it. You can burn fat for most of that, and you just don't need to be slamming 90 grams or even 80 grams of carbs or 70 grams of carbs per hour during most of your zone 1 training. The best reason to do high carb consuming or consumption during zone 1 training is just if you're in race prep mode and you want to get your gut used to it, then that's a great reason to. But yeah, you can just be a little bit more natural and let it come down a bit for the easier training.
So when we're talking about, let's just go back to like the term fat oxidation and getting to be a better, just more fit. I guess we can also think of it that way too. Yeah. How much of increasing fat oxidation in training is nutrition versus become a fitter athlete? Like just becoming 100%. In better shape.
100% is getting to be a better athlete. Train more consistently, sleep more, and eat your carbs.
So what you're saying is, if for the next 3 days all I eat are cashews, but then I go do an Ironman, my fat oxidation while training won't increase?
Oh, yes. Your fat oxidation will totally increase in training by eating more fat and less carbs. Definitely, yes. But your carb oxidation will decrease by more.
Okay, that's good. Okay, I kind of set you up there with that. I mean, I don't know a lot of people that just eat cashews all day, but that was kind of.
Well, a lot of the keto folks do really target high fat foods. And it's that carb restriction that actually causes the fat adaptation. But the key to remember is, with all carb restriction, you lose the ability to oxidize carbs faster than you gain the ability to oxidize fat. and fat burning is less metabolically efficient than carb burning during exercise.
And I'm just going to ask you a question here. Is there any way that somebody can do an Ironman and basically be in their quote unquote fat burning zone and just not need carbohydrates? Like, is that, can one do that, or are they just going to be incredibly slow and fatigued?
They could, if they are consuming carbs during their normal day-to-day, if they're not a ketogenic, like fully fat adapted, no carb athlete, they could do that, but they would be super duper slow and experience massive hypoglycemia for most of the race.
Yeah.
If they're a keto athlete, yes, they could do that, but again, fat is a less efficient fuel, so you end up spending more energy to go the same distance.
And again, like all this is just circling around the discussion of fat oxidation, right? And like that seems to be like what people really want to coin. But a lot of it still, from what you're saying, is if you train more and you get in better shape, that will naturally take care of most of the things that are going to be most important for race day versus nutrition, just messing around with nutritional things.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, modifying your nutrition is not how you get better at fat. Modifying your nutrition is not how you get better fat oxidation. Training more and more consistently over time for years and years is how you get better fat oxidation.
And some of these are questions too that people ask. So again, and this seems pretty obvious now. So lower carbohydrate rides, doing rides in a bonk state, fasted rides, probably not something that's going to be very helpful.
Yeah, not helpful unless I'm a little bit facetious again here. If you find that you are the person who always forgets to consume and always gets behind, and you just can't possibly make yourself remember to fuel on a schedule, and that's a very real thing. Like if you're not like a pretty regimented person, then maybe it makes sense psychologically to do a few rides with sporadic carbohydrate consumption. But good news, you're already doing that if you're that person, so you don't really need to like attempt to put it into your training like manually. You're doing that accidentally already, and so you don't need to prepare for that more just because you know yourself on race day to be the person who forgets to fuel.
Last question, this I promise, is that I've heard this discussed where people who implement fasted rides or rides in which they intend to bonk are more targeted for people with less training hours. And because when you implement this, it provides a greater stress to the system, which then somehow adds more training stress to their plan. And that, like, I've heard that from many people. And for some reason, like, it makes sense in my head.
Yeah.
But it also is that a positive stress that you're going to somehow get adaptations aerobically from that, which is interesting.
Very, very good question. Yes, training without fuel does add stress. And let's take, I'm trying to find the argument for this. Let's take a person who only has 8 hours a week to train, and they're a relatively new person. And so they need to make their training as stimulative as possible to maximize the rate of gains, because they have a long way to gain. They're relatively new, untrained, and they have limited hours. Is the best way to get really good at fat oxidation and really fit as fast as possible overall. And really what it comes down to is the best way to enhance race time to use some sort of carb restricted training to cause fat oxidation increases. And I think the answer is almost certainly not, because the training stress benefit that you get and the adaptation benefit that you get is so much smaller than the benefit you could get if you just trained a little bit harder with more carbs.
I love that. Yeah. Okay. Last question. Somebody sent this in. They said that, what should we make of all of this gut biome emerging science? I have no idea what any of that means.
Oh, goodness. Gut biome emerging science. First, it's emerging science, so don't do anything yet. Do nothing.
Okay.
Let it emerge. Let it be studied. Sign up for those studies and get good science done. Don't do anything on your own without a researcher helping you implement it yet. And that doesn't mean some medical doctor who thinks he knows endurance sports who wants to have you do some gut biome implementation. The only thing that you should be considering right now in terms of your gut is what are my gut tolerances? What have I been comfortable with? And then is there a training effect of that I can have on my gut to make it better at tolerating the glucose and fructose that I should be consuming? And the answer is yes, you can adapt to consuming more glucose and fructose. And the way that you do that is consume more glucose and fructose.
Cool. Sweet. Alex, we spent a lot of time here. So how do we paraphrase this whole conversation with nutrition during the race? Like, I guess, what is your 1 minute elevator discussion about this conversation?
I would say download the Saturday app and tell me how it goes. Other than that, because honestly, I've optimized it. Like, I've spent a lot of time talking to people about how it's going and like all the nuances of optimizing sugar, salt, their products, or sodium citrate and their products, their fluid intake, really getting feedback on how much weight they're losing and how the app is treating them. But yeah, I would say spend time, regardless of if it's with the app or not, spend time optimizing and experimenting with good glucose fructose ratio and use sodium citrate and consume more sugar, salt, or sodium and water.
Perfect. Alex, can't thank you enough. You've been a legend. You've been a rock star. I can't thank you enough.
That's far too generous. Thank you.
But yeah, all right, man. Well, have a good day. Thanks a lot.